Debunking human rights. Human rights principles posit the notion that no life shall be taken away unless as a result of due process of law. As lofty as the principle is, it's been fraught with so many problems with regards to its application. Here are a few of its problems, issues, and effects. The inflexibility of human rights propositions severely affects the emotional well-being of their advocates. Many people would say that gratitude is the least of all virtues, but ingratitude is the worst of all vices. Human rights proponents seem to have dulled their senses that they can no longer say thanks and enjoy any social and political felicities going on. The massive achievements of President Duterte in his first 50 days, the averting of the impending narco-state, and the chance of ending decades-old rebellion no longer appeal to their senses. Even the safeties of their neighbors in dark alleys, the liberation from the grip of oligarchs, and the effusive dispensation of good graces coming from the executive department could hardly make a dent to their gloomy disposition caused by deaths of criminals, which are not given a second chance to life. People can't quite get its real-world value. Just like any other in the realms of nature, it's fairly easy to pinpoint a problem, for example, abuse of authorities, but it's fairly hard to be consistent in formulating a system of principles such as human rights. For example, President Duterte succeeded in making Davao City a few steps away from becoming a society more inclined to honor the all-encompassing human rights, more feasible because when wealth is available to all, the next tendency would be to let contemporary justice system rolls down to all citizens and from their dark past. But proponents would say that this is pyrrhic because it was achieved not in accordance with human rights principles. Which one then is of greater value, a community more poised to honor human rights or a criminally infested communities, even without showing any signs of escaping from their miserable state, formed as a result of twisting the arm of law enforcers just to ensure lives are preserved at all times? Citizens can seem to accept that criminals are given more dues rather than the innocents, no matter how much effort the advocates would try to explain that it's their sworn duty to protect those who would be bereft of due process. The value it presents to the populace is neither palatable nor squaring with reality. It ignores historical causality. Human rights seem quite contented in focusing on the direct relationship between authorities and offenders of the law. However, it results in the blatant disregard what makes authorities, which they try to zero in. Political units are formed by communities which share the outcome of the authorities dealing with the criminals. For example, if the delay of court cases were in effect, any criminal who can subvert the system remains a threat to the communities. This creates tension. That is why when human rights agencies call the people to rally for their purpose, they can't easily gain sympathies because these communities are not naive enough to know these agencies are likewise materially responsible for the threats they face each day. It plants a seed of anachronistic fear. Citation of dictators such as Hitler is quite common raised by advocates in reference to the action of President Duterte that bears close resemblance to the actions of authoritarians of history. However, such a call is downright anachronistic. People should bear in mind that their situation before is too different today. There are so many landscapes where supporters thrive, and though they may appear to show signs of unwitting alliance, this is far from the truth. They still maintain a set of demarcation lines that the president would have to operate, and this may vary from one to another. No individual is loyal to the persona of the president enough to rally blind supporters and adherents en masse if the president would someday act and contrary to his mandate. It assumes it can operate in any culture in a time of peace. In times of peace, human rights advocates tend to ignore the varying contours of socio-political landscape, how far it is already in the state of progress. It assumes that interjecting its principles in another country would create a better result rather than humbly understanding there are steps the other government has to take in order to meet head-on its own unique challenges to prevent a colossal war. Its claim of universality is not backed by empirical evidence. Perhaps the most acceptable fact is that this is more of a convention rather than a universal notion. It can even be argued that it's more tied to the influence of German Romanticism, where emotions play a very vital part in the criterion of truth. Feelings of sympathy for other human beings are now the new fountain of rationality. It does not factor the cost of its application. Applying human rights principles incurs huge burden to the government, a kind of problem that is not a big issue for a wealthy country like US, but for a developing country it added another layer of unnecessary cost. Even Lee Kuan Yew balked at the idea of adding extra prison rooms for criminals, many of them are not citizens, just to house drug convicts that are not executed. If you know that Singapore is already struggling to cope with limited land area, this suggestion is kind of absurd. When the Philippines started lifting the death penalty, Amnesty International might have sung praises to heaven, but they haven't put the bill of the ballooning population inside the national penitentiary. Legislators like to propose for the policemen to wear camera vests just to ensure they won't violate their legal mandate to only shoot when met with resistance and threat to life, but the police force were quick to respond that they can't even afford to buy enough ammo for their men, let alone buy an expensive camera. The line between Western and Eastern worldview is blurred. One of the biggest casualties of human rights universal claims is the distinctiveness of worldviews between the East and the West. The East addresses problems with urgency while the West is prone to abstraction. It's not incidental that progenitor of its principles were from the Western world. This introduces a cultural problem called ethnocentrism. Which one is more serious, ethnocentrism or being true to your worldview but less adherent to human rights while the country is still developing? Ignorance of criminal psychology and time. Drugs retroactively affect their dependents and thus exponentially increase their numbers, that any time lost in curtailing its growth means an inch closer to the realization that the country is heading towards narcopolitics. Advocates complain when Duterte got elected people can no longer wait. However, such observation is bereft of criminal psychology. The unabated growth of criminals does not make a society better over time. Twisting the arms of the enforcers to ensure human rights is being respected at all times can also mean giving the dark world an extra shot in the arm. A refuge for the inept and the scoundrel. If the justice system is dysfunctional, people in power or crime syndicates can easily subvert the system by using their wealth to lobby court decisions just to avoid prison sentence or get out of prison. Worse, the inept or the scoundrel can easily invoke due process of law just to stifle anyone who is trying to fix the systemic problem in government. Can tell the distinction between general and particular. Proponents are sometimes tempted to cite a particular method and assume it's a better solution to uphold the human rights of all individuals. For example, the love of the community can achieve much to correct the criminal behavior of an individual. This argument is fatally flawed and partly explains why there is an unabated growth of drug dependence left unchecked simply because the government prefers a particular solution to address a general problem. There is no such thing as false dichotomy. One favorite argument being raised by advocates is charging false dichotomy to those who are favoring the killings of criminals or the prevalence of the practice thereof, either as a tacit endorsement by the president or authorities or by encouraging the men in uniform to kill rather than be killed during raids. They believe that there are other alternatives that will work more humane and more effective. The problem with this kind of argument is it remains theoretical in a particular setting. If President Duterte is successful in both local and national settings, what makes theirs superior or better when they don't have track record to boot? Is the 3 decades past martial law more than enough evidence that their alternative does not work and it's only a figment of an imagination? It cites a historical fallacy. To discourage the use of heavy-handed approach in dealing with criminality that could lead to abuse of basic human rights, proponents make use of a number of studies that prove it does not work. However, going back to elementary logic, this observation falls under the historical fallacy if X then Y construct. Just because it fails elsewhere, it would fail all the time. There are infinite number of particulars and it would take an infinite amount of time to prove the conclusion is true. It violates the doctrine of the mean. Human rights mandate to prevent abuse of authority is very commendable, but when it tries to overstretch its arms by interpreting all forms of sizable killings as heading towards its abstracted anarchy, it introduces all sorts of problems its advocates are unwilling to acknowledge. They fail to see that the social problems they introduce will make it harder for a government to deal with its own internal problems, hence perpetuating the cycle of abuse. It fails to honor the political mandate of leaders to protect their communities as a sacred duty. It fails to acknowledge that the standard of governance is already at the lowest point. For example, it seems fine to have a corrupt bureaucracy for as long as there are no killings. They're willing to call their countrymen as piece of garbage, but treat international agencies and foreigners like rock stars and demigods. It is inconsistent. Apart from its lofty claim of universality, human rights also presuppose that it serves as a higher standard where every government dealing with its citizens must be measured against. Now, this is problematic right from the outset. For one, if human rights claim it's a superior abstraction and does not need concrete proofs to prove its worth, then the debate shifts into what makes an abstraction superior to that of a real experience. If human rights proponents would shift to value assessment, then this would suffer its worst fate, lack of consistency. If a principle is measured by its value, then what measures the value's value? So on ad infinitum?